Okay, so I bet everybody in the room already knows Joel Nagel, but I want to tell you a little bit about him and what he has meant to me. I first met Joel when I was about 27 years old, about 6 months after I launched my first company, which was Stansberry Research. And I met him on a cruise in the Caribbean. And I think he and I were the only people on the boat under 70 years old. So we spent a lot of time together. And we got to know each other quite well. And I've just been amazed to see what Joel has done with his career since I met him. He's probably 5 or 6 years older than me, but he was in his early 30s. I was in my late 20s. We were starting our careers. And since then, Joel's gone on to build some incredible things. He built a 2,500 acre resort in Nicaragua called Grand Pacifica. He's built a beautiful boutique resort in Ambergris Bay. He's developed an incredible reputation as an offshore asset protection attorney. And he's done just incredible things, like he became the ambassador to Austria from Belize, which I think is pretty neat. That's not typical for a lawyer who grew up in Pittsburgh. Please welcome Joel Nagel.
Thanks, Porter. Wow, it's really nice to be here. Thank you, Porter. Porter always jokes that we're good friends because we got to know each other before either of us had any success. And I think there's a certain truth to that, but it's really wonderful to be here to see this group today. You know, when I speak at conferences about asset protection, particularly investment conferences, everybody is talking about making money. And I love learning about making money. I sat through all the presentations, and I don't pretend to know anything about making money. In fact, frequently my clients will even say, Joel, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I'll say, well, I could give you my opinion, but opinions are like noses. Everybody has one. What I talk about is the opposite. What I talk about is asset protection. In a sports analogy, asset protection is defense, right? Everybody else is telling you how to make money. I'm trying to help you keep what you already have. Right? Like that E.F. Hutton commercial for the people my age and older in the room, right? It's not about what you make, it's about what you keep. And I'm always amazed when I meet clients, doctors and engineers and people who make a lot of money that have almost no net worth because the money comes in and the money goes out. So let's talk about asset protection for the next little bit here. So this is what I really like to talk about for the next, almost 30 minutes. What is asset protection? Why do we do it? What risks are we protecting ourselves from? What are the benefits of international versus domestic asset protection planning? And what are the most common structures to achieve asset protection? So hopefully we'll just zip through this and then we'll see how much time we have left. So number one, what is asset protection? Protect what's yours, right? I mean, if you don't have anything to protect, if you don't have any assets, then you don't need asset protection. Only about 6% of Americans have a liquid net worth of over $100,000. I mean, $100,000 doesn't sound like a lot of money. A liquid net worth of $100,000, only 6%. Well, who do you think are the defendants in most lawsuits? The 94% who don't have a liquid net worth of $100,000 or the 6% who do? So I suspect everybody in this room, you're in that category. So you need to really think about protecting what's yours. It's not about just making money. It's about keeping it, protecting it, preserving it, and ultimately passing it on to your heirs. Now, for some people, asset protection planning can be extremely complicated. We can have trusts and foundations and IBCs and GmbHs and insurance products, on and on and on and on. But for some people, it's just taking your 16-year-old daughter's credit card away from her, right? I have one of those. I actually have 7 children, and I can tell you that this is definitely effective asset protection planning. I also want to talk about what asset protection is not, because particularly at conferences, especially offshore conferences, you get people say, oh, if you do this and this, you'll never pay taxes again. Well, when you hear that, turn around and run for the hills. That's not what asset protection planning is about. It is not a scheme to evade taxes. You remember Leona Helmsley's comment about only little people pay taxes, and then she ended up in the orange jumpsuit. So I don't think anybody here would particularly want that outcome. So it's not about evading taxes. It's about doing what's legal, ethical, and moral, right? So some people, though, still think that it's all about hide and seek, right? We're hiding this here and there. We're making shell games. People won't be able to figure out what's going on. But it's kind of like in this picture, the little girl on the right. She thinks that you can't see her because her eyes are covered, except she's peeking, right? That's what people think. But the reality is we live in an extremely transparent world. I have a lot of friends in the banking industry. I'm chairman of a small bank myself. And, with all the regulations that are in place, if you go into a bank and you transfer money to Panama, Caymans, Belize, Cook Islands, any of those places, the government will know about that transfer before you've even left the bank. Because those reports are done in real time. You send a wire, you get the receipt, the recipient gets the receipt, and the government gets the receipt. So it's not about hide and seek. It's actually a different children's game. It's show and tell. What we're really saying, this is what I've done. It's legal, it's moral, it's ethical, right? I am not going to let myself be the low-hanging fruit in any kind of lawsuits. And just to back up and give you a quick story, early in my career, I was representing a doctor who had sold his practice to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and he had a few $1 million. We paid some taxes. He put the rest of the money in a trust for his children, and about 6 months later, his longtime nurse sued him. And it turns out there's law firms that actually specialize in these types of suits, and they alleged that he had defrauded Medicaid and Medicare. Now, that doesn't sound very good, does it? So it quickly went from being a civil matter to a civil and a criminal matter, which sounds even worse, right? Now you're thinking orange jumpsuits. But 6-8 months later, in open court, the judge apologized to my client in the criminal matter and said there was not one shred of evidence that he had done anything improper in terms of the way he'd handled his accounts. So the criminal case, it's thrown out. Now you think, okay, well, what about the civil case? It should be thrown out too, right? You'd think that, but that's not how our system works in America. So everybody deserves their day in court. And as the court date was getting closer and closer, we had a deposition in one of the big law firm boardrooms. And the opposing counsel, my client's under oath, swears to tell the truth and all of that. And they're asking him all these silly questions about where he went to medical school and this, that, and the other. And then they finally came to the one question that they really wanted to know the answer to, and it's the whole reason we were there in the first place. They said, let's just say Jones. Dr. Jones, when you sold your practice, what happened to the money? Where'd the money go? Well, he explained. We paid some taxes, created this trust. Trust happened to be in Belize. We had copies of the trust documents. I had the business card of the trustee who said if you want to reach out and contact them. By the way, here's a copy of the 709 gift tax return that we filed when we made the gift that was sent to the IRS. So now all of a sudden the eyebrows are going up and there's some little whispering going on. And the attorneys asked for a 5-minute recess to talk to their client out in the hall. And when they came back, they said, well, we're going to have to reschedule the deposition. And about 3 weeks later, the case was unilaterally dismissed by the plaintiffs. And the attorney called me to explain. And he didn't really violate his attorney-client relationship, but it became very clear what happened in that little 5-minute conversation. They went out in the hall with their client. They said, look, nurse, Smith, we think you have a really good case, but this trust is in Belize. It's going to be really difficult. We're going to have to hire local counsel. There's going to be travel, blah, 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 blah. We're still willing to represent you, but we're not willing to do it on a contingency fee basis anymore. The whole thing about, no fee unless we get money for you. You've all seen those commercials, right? And then the nurse says, but wait a minute, you said this was a contingency. I didn't have to pay anything. Well, we can't honor that anymore. And the nurse says, well, I'm not going to. They wanted a $25,000 retainer fee. And the nurse said, no, I'm not going to do that. The whole case fell apart. It wasn't because, that we were of any kind of hide and seek approach. It was show and tell. We were saying, this is what we did. If you want to go after it, here's the party that you're going to have to sue. Here's the jurisdiction you're going to have to bring the lawsuit in. And, the whole thing fell apart because nobody really had the stomach for that. And let's face it, most law firms are really just sort of, blackmail might be too strong, but more like green mail, right? I mean, you have these law firm factories where the young attorneys are told that they must file so many lawsuits per week to keep their jobs. So you have people manufacturing lawsuits. Now, Sun Tzu wrote the book, The Art of War, like 2,500 years ago. And there's passages in that book that I really love as an asset protection attorney. Of course, he's talking about war, and I kind of view this as war to a certain extent. And he says, the prevention of defeat lies in our own hands. So the skillful fighter puts himself in a position where he can't lose. In other words, before he wins the war, he wants to make sure he can't lose the war. And that's the perfect analogy for what I do. I'm not going to help you make any of the ROI projections that you heard other people talking about. I'm going to make sure that you won't lose the war. You can go to bed at night, can get up tomorrow, and your money's still there. That's what asset protection planning is all about. All right, so now I want to just talk about the types of risk factors that are out there people are always concerned about. People don't like talking about physical risks, but I would suggest that physical risks influence a lot of the decision making in our life. Where we live, where we work, where we go to school, why we're here on this beautiful property. It has to do with, being in the back of your mind concerned about physical risks. I don't want to suggest that some people in the room wouldn't have come if Porter had the conference in downtown Baltimore, but maybe some people wouldn't have, right? Same thing with, again, where you live, where you go to school. So physical risks come into planning all the time. The second risk we're concerned about are economic risks. And I love Porter's comment about the dollars and I owe you and the euros of who owes you. I think the economists describe the dollar, the euro, and the yen as a beauty contest between the three ugliest women in the world. That's how they described it. Sorry, it's a little bit of a male chauvinistic comment, but I think you get the point. So when clients come to see me, again, I'm not an investment advisor, I'm not telling them what to invest in, but when I ask, well, tell me about what currency your investments are denominated. And they look at me like I'm a Martian. Well, what are you talking about, Nagel? And I have to ask it 6 different ways, and then they're like, well, dollars, duh. But that's not the case for other people in the world. If you'd sit down with a group like this, let's say you were all wealthy Germans, and we were sitting around having this event, and I asked that question, people would say, oh, well, I've got this in Swiss francs, I've got this in British pounds, I've got this in dollars, this in euros. Why? Because they inherently understand that there's a lot of economic risks associated with all types of currencies. Voltaire said 200 years ago, every paper currency will eventually reach its intrinsic value, and that value is 0. So it's just a question of, how long it takes to get there. And so you want to be diversified. And asset protection planning, particularly offshore asset protection planning, this is a central thing. Most clients, when they set up, let's say, an offshore trust, and they start talking about how they want to, what assets or what investments they want to make with that trust, they're not talking about U.S. stocks and bonds and mutual funds. They're talking about foreign real estate and gold and Bitcoin and, maybe some things that they like in the U.S., but a foreign, parallel investment. If you like big 50, blue chip stocks, maybe you buy big 50 European and Asian stocks to get more diversification. All right. Then there's taxation risks. Taxation, look, I could talk for several hours just about taxation risks. I started as a boring tax attorney. There are definitely things that you can still do, right? There are lots of people here in the room that have IRAs and 401ks and SARSEPs, KIOs, insurance products. Why do you have these things? Because you can legally defer taxation. So we don't need to think that if we go offshore, we're going to artificially create an environment where we won't pay taxes when you already have a legal environment where you don't have to pay taxes, at least not today. So we try to expand and stretch and make sure that people realize, hey, did you know that you can invest your IRA offshore? You can invest your 401k offshore. You can buy a foreign insurance product denominated in a different currency with a death benefit in a different currency. These things are out there. They exist. They're well tried and tested, and the IRS isn't going to come attack you for doing them. All right. And then litigation risk we talked about. Look, the U.S. is the most litigious country in the world. A new federal lawsuit's filed every 17 seconds of every minute, every hour of every day. And if you add state and local litigation, it falls to about 7 seconds. And to me, one of the most destructive forms of litigation is divorce. People don't always think of divorce as litigation, but you heard the previous speaker talking about being involved in a divorce for 18 years. I promise you it was litigation. And if litigation is akin to a war, then divorce is akin to a civil war, because again, you're fighting over the same pot of money. I had a big executive from a pretty famous company headquartered in Pittsburgh came to see me, and he was telling me, my wife and I, after 37 years, we decided we're getting divorced. And I said, really sorry to hear that, blah blah blah. And he said, I thought we could be civilized about it. We put all our assets together, and I told her, look, let's just divide them up 50-50. And she said, no, I get 60%. And he's like, that's not really fair. That's not fair. It just really rubs me the wrong way. He goes, what do you think, Joel? I said, well, Tony, look, I'm not a divorce lawyer, but you asked me what I think, so I'm going to tell you. Who have you hired as your law firm? He told me this big law firm in Pittsburgh, lawyers charge $2,000 an hour. And then I said, well, who's your wife hired? Another big law firm, same thing. He's like, and every time those lawyers get together, there's 8 or 10 of them sitting around the conference room table. I'm like, yep, I know exactly what it looks like. I said, so let me ask you this. When this process is over, do you think you're going to have more money, the same amount of money, or less money than you have today? He looked at me and he said, well, less money. I said, Tony, take the deal. And he took the deal. The wife was very happy, and he had a big grin on his face as he drove off into the sunset with his 27-year-old girlfriend. So anyways, so litigation risks are definitely something, litigation risks are really what started asset protection planning, right? The classic doctor was worried about getting sued. We'd create an offshore trust. It's expanded beyond that for so many of the reasons, like economic diversity and parking money outside the country, all those things. All right, so do we have a level playing field? Absolutely not. The U.S. is a very pro-plaintiff system, right? That's why they say that the nuisance value of a lawsuit is about $50,000. So if you sue somebody, your doctor, the Walmart, if a can of paint falls in your head, whatever, at some point, they're going to accept a settlement of $50,000 or less because it's going to cost them that much or more and tie up people and time. So that's your secret tip for today. That's the litigation risk. So when we do offshore planning, are we trying to have a level playing field? You hear politicians talk about level playing fields all the time. Heck no. We're not trying to get a level playing field. We want the opposite. We want a system that's pro-defense. We want a system that makes it very difficult for plaintiffs to jump through hoops and hurdles. They have to place bonds. It's loser-pay system like in the UK. If you sue me in the UK, I can spend as much money as I want defending myself. And guess what? If I win, you're paying my legal costs. And if you're indigent and you can't pay those fees, your law firm has to pay me. Can you imagine? I mean, do you think that you think frivolous lawsuits would go away if we had a system like that in the U.S.? Absolutely. But, I think 95% of all House and Senate members are lawyers, so they're not going to change the system that we have. Anyways, so why international asset protection? First of all, no recognition of U.S. judgments. In the U.S., we have a thing called the Full Faith and Credit Clause of the United States and of our Constitution, and it requires judgments in one state to be enforced in other states. So if you sue me and get a judgment against me, and let's say in Texas, and then you bring that judgment to where I live in Pennsylvania, and you want to enforce that judgment, I cannot go to a Pennsylvania court and say, well, I don't think the lawsuit was really fair. I can't bring up any substantive arguments. Why? Because the full faith and credit clause. Pennsylvania says, nope, we have this judgment from Texas. We're enforcing it. We're taking your house. We're seizing your bank accounts. Whatever it is. I don't get a chance to redefend myself. But in the offshore world, that's not the case. Why? Because there is no full faith and credit clause. In fact, many foreign jurisdictions have a bright line test which says what came first, the lawsuit or the creation of the structure. If I create, let's say, an asset protection trust for you in Belize today, and tomorrow somebody sues you, in 3 months or 6 months or whatever, somebody, tries to get traction on that lawsuit, at some point a judge is going to look at the creation of the trust, and they're going to look at the date of the lawsuit, and they're just going to simply say which came first. It's a bright line test. So if I'm worried about somebody suing me in the future, I want to use a jurisdiction that has a very short period where people can challenge the creation of the trust itself. So Belize, Nevis, Cook Islands, Liechtenstein, jurisdictions like that are very common. All right, elimination of statute of frauds. That's another British common law concept that says, well, when I made the transfer to, let's say, a trust or to another person, did I have a bad intent in my mind when I did that? Well, that's a very difficult thing. Like, did I have a fraudulent intent when I made this transfer? How are you really going to prove that? It's very difficult. So some countries have eliminated that, and then others have also instituted a bond requirement that says, okay, you could sue me, you could sue the trust, but before you can proceed, the court's going to make you place a bond equivalent to the value of the lawsuit. And if you lose, again, they're going to take your money to pay for everything. So it doesn't close the doors of justice to plaintiffs, but it sort of ups the ante, right? What they have to really believe, they have to have good evidence. It can't be frivolous. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about jurisdictional benefits. I'm from Pittsburgh, so I always like working in a slide about Pittsburgh. And unfortunately, we don't have a very good football team this year, but this picture is Super Bowl IX, and that's the famous steel curtain. And I don't think anybody would want to be the Minnesota ball carrier. That looks pretty miserable. Incidentally, when the Steelers hired coach Chuck Noll, he came in, the Steelers had been 1-13. So the next year, they got the first pick in the draft. And he used the first pick in the draft to draft a guy by the name of Mean Joe Green. Well, Mean Joe Green, who's in the Hall of Fame, is one of the best defensive players ever. So Chuck Noll didn't try to figure out who's the best ball carrier? Who's the best quarterback? Who's the best wide receiver? No, he said, I want a strong defense. Incidentally, the halftime score of Super Bowl IX, lowest ever. Pittsburgh 2, Minnesota 0. How do you get 2 points in football? Safety. Who scores the safety? Defense. So anyways, you see my point. You want to make sure that you're as protected as you possibly can be. I always tell people start with defense, but most people, like most of you in the room, you've already amassed a certain amount of money. It's never too late. It's too late, and I get these calls, I would say 2 or 3 times a month. Somebody calls and they tell me, hey, I'd really like to create an offshore structure, and they're going on and on and on, and then it comes out, yeah, I got served a lawsuit 2 weeks ago, and I'm a little stressed out about it. Guess what? Too late, right? You have to do this kind of planning when the sun's shining, when the skies are blue. All right. So you have jurisdictional benefits, tax benefits. If you live overseas, anybody in the room actually live outside the country? Maybe a few. There's a thing in the tax code called the foreign earned income exclusion that exempts the first $120,000 per person, $240,000 per couple. You also can get a housing exclusion, $36,000. So that means you can earn $276,000 outside the U.S., pay no tax in the jurisdiction where you live, and pay no tax in the U.S. That's not, other countries tax you not on citizenship like the U.S., they tax you based on residence. So people say, my God, look at the tax code in France. It goes up to 78%. That would be terrible. Well, you know what? It's not terrible. If you don't like it, move to Belgium. You don't pay any French tax. Because European countries and other developed countries of the world, they don't tax you based on the fact that you have a passport from their country. They tax you based on where you live, where you reside. If you don't live there, if you don't reside there, you don't pay tax. The U.S. is not that way. We're like, we're a throwback to the Roman Empire. We say, you get U.S. benefits wherever you live in the world. The U.S. Marines are going to come and save you if you have a problem somewhere. So because of that, like Rome, we're the only country in the world that taxes our citizens based on citizenship. So when clients come to me and say, I don't want to pay any more U.S. tax, I say, are you prepared to expatriate and give up your U.S. citizenship? And then they look at me like deer in the headlights, and they're like, well, no. I'm like, well, that's the only legal way to do it. Any other way, you're going to have a serious problem. All right. Tax benefits, privacy benefits. We have still countries where you have bank secrecy laws. Unfortunately, the U.S. is not one of them. We actually have a set of laws in the U.S. called the bank secrecy laws, and it says that the banks have to give your information to the government anytime the government asks, and they have to keep that disclosure secret from you. That's what bank secrecy means in the U.S. It's literally like the world of the Mad Hatter. But in other countries in the world, that's not the case, right? Secrecy means banks communicate with you, you communicate with banks, and there's no other disclosures. Now, in the U.S., back in 2010, President Obama signed into law something called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA for short. It became implemented in 2014, and it pressures foreign banks, foreign governments to turn over information about Americans at the risk of having very harsh withholding taxes on payments going to that institution. So you find in most countries, even tax haven countries, there's a little bit of a carve out now with bank secrecy, and that is, when you sign up for a bank account in Cayman, Switzerland, wherever, you're going to sign a notice that says in certain circumstances these banks can turn your information over to the U.S. government. So that's a good reason for you to report what you're supposed to report, because if the foreign bank reports that you have $1 million sitting there and you forget to do that, unless you're Hunter Biden, you're probably going to jail. So anyways, corporate secrecy laws, again, bearer instruments. I always find it interesting, when I read about so-and-so allegedly owns. Why did the newspaper, why did they use the word allegedly? Well, because they don't really know, right? They think the guy owns this company or that company, but they don't really know. I always laugh when I read the list of Forbes' richest people in the world, because I promise you the richest people in the world are not in a Forbes magazine. They're not on that list at all. IBC's bearer instruments, trust foundation laws, again, that are not public. So I create a trust in a foreign jurisdiction, that information exists, but it's not public. Somebody can't walk into a trust registry in Nevis and say, show me your registry and who are all the owners. They're going to throw you out. All right. So estate benefits, again, the rule against perpetuity says you can't leave your assets into perpetuity. Again, it's another British common law concept. But why? If you earn money and you pay tax on it, it's yours. Why can't you leave it to your children and your heirs for the next 1,000 years? Just the income. Pay for, school, education, medical, welfare, whatever. Maximum control from beyond the grave. I wish I could talk more about life insurance. It's really the way that wealthy people still today move money generationally. It works great. The money builds up tax deferred and it comes out tax free. There's no better way than that. It's the glaring loophole that's left in the tax code. The only problem is, for it to work, you have to die, okay? So it's not planning for everybody, but it is a great way to steward wealth from one generation to the next and avoiding probate and forced heirship rules. Now, I'm just about out of time, but I just wanted to throw the most common structures and strategies up here that people always want to know about. We have trusts, revocable and irrevocable. I would say that only an irrevocable trust is truly an asset protection trust, asset protection vehicle. A revocable trust can be helpful, can help you avoid probate, can keep your information quiet, but by its very nature, it's revocable. So if somebody brings a lawsuit against you and, the judge says, well, it's in a trust, but it's revocable, so you have to revoke it. Again, if you don't listen to the judge, back to the orange jumpsuit. Irrevocable trusts are they're sort of the Cadillac. The main idea there is if this clicker represents my asset and I give it to this gentleman here and he's holding the asset and I'm not, how can somebody sue me and take it away from me? It's that simple. Foundations are civil law versions of trusts, and basically Napoleon didn't like the English common law, but eventually the civil law found a workaround. That's foundations. Corporations, but corporations are one-way protection. It's a shield that you hold out in front of you. When the arrows are coming in, you can use them to block yourself. But the opposite is not true. That's a big fallacy with corporations. People think, well, my assets are in a company, so they're safe. No, they're not. If somebody gets a judgment against you and you own 100% of a company, judge is going to say, well, why don't you just turn your company over to the plaintiff, right? It doesn't protect the company's asset. It protects you. All right. Insurance, again, I'd like to think that that's an interesting concept to talk more about. Non-reportable foreign assets. There used to be a lot of them. People always wanted to know what they are. Now there's only two. You have the precious metals, gold, silver, platinum, palladium. If you have precious metals sitting in a vault somewhere overseas, do you have to report them? No, you don't. Why? I don't know. Maybe some IRS guy has all his money offshore in gold and silver. I don't really know, but that's not reportable. And the other one's foreign real estate, okay? Those are the two non-reportable foreign assets. Foreign residency and citizenship, it used to be just the one wacky guy in the back of the room that wanted to talk about that. Now it's very mainstream. Every person I talk to, they're like, well, how can I get an extra residency? How can I get an extra citizenship? I'd really like to have a passport. I think COVID was the best-selling tool for that ever. I have European citizenship and residence in U.S., and I was flying back and forth the whole time. Sometimes I was on a plane with like 4 passengers and 8 crew, because the Europeans said Americans couldn't come, and America said Europeans couldn't come. So the only way to go back and forth was to really have both. And then debt. Debt's the last thing I'm going to say because I'm out of time. Debt is not a structure, but it is a strategy. I'm not talking about credit card debt. I'm talking about debt on assets that you can't move, primarily real estate. If you have a $5 million home somewhere, somebody's going to come and sue you. The plaintiff's got big eyes because they think, hey, I'm going to get this property as in a judgment. And then they find out that Bank of America has a first mortgage for $4.85 million. You think they're interested in that asset anymore? You think they're going to get in front of Bank America? And if there's a sheriff sale and the sale is forced, you think that they're going to, again, they're not going to get anything. So they're not going to try. And that's where debt can really be an effective tool. I'm out of time. I'm actually over time. Apologize for that. You guys are a great audience. I'll be around. If anybody would like to talk to me, I'll try to do that. Thank you very much.